I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military.
Fresh off the heels of publicly threatening to withhold federal disaster relief from blue states that disagree with him, this morning, Donald Trump made another unhinged threat on the Fox propaganda network, saying that he will deploy the military against his liberal political opponents. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, this is we got some more clips to look at, but this is just back-to-back unhinged fascistic threats from Donald Trump. And despite how unhinged this is, despite how anti-American this is, the other thing to remember is that this is a painfully close election that Donald Trump may very well win. So with all of that in mind, I want you to listen to this exchange between Trump and Fox News' Maria Bartiromo.
Are you expecting chaos on Election Day?
No, I don't think so. Not from the side that votes for Trump.
But I'm just wondering if these outside agitators will start up on Election Day. Let's say you win. I mean, let's remember, you've got 50,000 Chinese nationals in this country in the last couple of years. Yeah. You've got people on the terrorist watch list, 350 in the last couple of years. You've got, like you said, 13,000 murderers and 15,000 rapists. Right. What are you expecting? Joe Biden said he doesn't think it's going to be a peaceful Election Day.
Well, he doesn't have any idea what's happening in all fairness. He spends most of his day sleeping. I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of Election Day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen.
So it's important to remember, given Donald Trump's, let's say, liberal, pun intended, use of words, that he is very imprecise with his language. So, for example, he refers to his political opponents as communists and Marxists and fascists. So there's no reason to believe that he's talking about anybody other than anybody who disagrees with him, right? Some MAGA Republicans are going to say, no. When he's referring to radical leftists, he's referring to the 0.0000005% of the population that will, engage in terroristic activities for progressive reasons, even though, again, political terrorism is much more predominant on the right. The problem is we have no reason to read such good faith into Donald Trump's words. When he refers to the Democratic Party as Marxist, communist, fascist, and, migrants, legal or otherwise, as vermin poisoning the blood of our country, we should assume that he's referring to all of his political opponents. And I want you to think about that. That means Donald Trump thinks the majority of the country, because again, the majority of the country doesn't like Donald Trump. Donald Trump has never been a popular president. Donald Trump has never breached 50% approval rating as a candidate or the president. He has been more disliked than liked. So he thinks the vast majority of the country that disagree with him are his enemies. And if need be, he should be able to sic the National Guard or even the military against them. It's pretty unhinged and fascistic stuff. Rolling Stone and the Independent, I believe, have done articles about this, and Rolling Stone has a really good one. So Trump wants to use the military to target Americans who oppose him. The former president says he thinks U.S. troops should be deployed, if necessary, against radical left lunatics on election day. And of course, it's discussing the clip that we just played. Again, something else before we get into it that I want you to remember is he's saying that the people who disagree with him are worse than people on terrorist watch lists. Keep that in mind. Throughout his campaign, Trump has laid out a dystopian vision for America where the military uses violence to detain and to deport immigrants, suppress protests, and target criminals. He has used fascistic violent language and recently repeated his vow to be a dictator for one day if elected. At a rally last year in Iowa, Trump promised to use federal forces to, quote, get crime out of our cities, end quote. He went on to say that Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco were, quote, crime dens run by Democrats. As Rolling Stone reported, during his time in the White House, Trump became enamored with the idea of using mass executions against gang members and drug kingpins. The former president has also said he would send potentially hundreds of thousands of troops to close the southern border and construct immigrant detention camps. He's threatened to engage the military in mass deportations, which could trigger large public demonstrations. Quote, I expect massive civil disobedience and then violence if Trump decides to suppress it using the military, Michael Klarman, a Harvard law professor and an expert in executive power, told Rolling Stone last month. In private emails from a Trump-aligned group obtained by the New York Times, supporters discussed the idea of using troops to stop riots by protesters. Quote, I would certainly use the National Guard if police were unable to stop protests, Trump told Time magazine in April. During his presidency, Trump proposed troops shoot protesters and undocumented immigrants. And this is kind of the source of this. The Insurrection Act of 1807 grants the president broad authority to use armed forces during emergencies to quell civil unrest. Quote, it's a huge blank check and it's easily subject to abuse. It's easy to imagine abuse, Harvard law professor and Presidential Reform Project leader Jack Goldsmith told NPR. So you have to remember that the Insurrection Act of 1807, which is not the first iteration of the act, there was one that even, was passed before it during the time of President Washington. You have to remember that these blank check emergency powers afforded to presidents of the United States were intended for the likes of President Washington, President John Adams, President Thomas Jefferson, who, for all their flaws, were statesmen who were leery about abusing, federal authority, particularly Washington and Jefferson. So the idea was the founding fathers were like, you know what? Surely the American people won't elect somebody who would abuse the awesome powers of the presidency. So we need not worry about these break glass in case of emergency powers because statesmen, people of good faith, people who are loyal not to a particular party or certainly not to themselves or foreign actors, but to the country as a whole, would only use them if absolutely necessary. And it would almost give them, an ulcer to use. They would be so terrified to use the power. We need not fear abuse. They couldn't envision somebody like Donald Trump getting control of the presidency. Although Washington, I suppose, prophesied it because he basically gave everything but Donald Trump's, social security number when he gave his farewell address. But the Insurrection Act is effectively non-justiciable, as constitutional scholars agree, that basically even the Supreme Court, which really couldn't check a president anyway because they have no army of their own, but even if they wanted to, the Supreme Court really doesn't have much by way of justiciable authority in terms of regulating how the president uses the Insurrection Act. So it is a blank check. Why didn't Trump use it in 2020? MAGA Republicans will ask. Well, it's because he was surrounded by people in the White House, in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and in the Defense Department, and in the Justice Department that threatened to resign, that threatened to push back. Basically, he faced such a revolt internally that he finally backed away from using these awesome powers. But he's made it abundantly clear that he doesn't intend to have these people surrounding him in a second administration. He's going to surround himself with yes men. And on that topic, this idea of using the awesome powers of the military or just the organs of the federal government against your political opponents, I'm also reminded of an interview that J.D. Vance had earlier today in which he lied about Donald Trump's history and propensity towards using the powers of the federal government against his political opponents. Take a look.
Would Donald Trump go after his political opponents? Would Donald Trump go after his political opponents? He suggested that in the past.
Martha, he was president for 4 years, and he didn't go after his political opponents. You know who did go after her political opponents? Kamala Harris, who has tried to arrest everything from pro-life activists to her political opponents. He said those people who cheated will be prosecuted as a weapon against people. Well, he said that people who violated our election laws will be prosecuted. I think that's the administration of law. He didn't say people are going to go to jail because they disagree with me. That has, in fact, been the administration and the policy of Kamala Harris, Martha.
So President Biden and Vice President Harris haven't said that either, right? So this idea that, we need only fear Trump if he says people who disagree with me will go to jail. Well, he's been much more suggestive of that in his language and his rhetoric than Biden or Harris have ever been, number one. Number two, Donald Trump did attempt to use the Justice Department against his political opponents. It's a lie from MAGA Republicans like J.D. Vance, hoping that you won't look into it, hoping that because Hillary Clinton was not successfully prosecuted by Donald Trump's Justice Department, he must have never made an attempt to do so. But it's not true. As we discussed in a few months ago, or excuse me, at least a few weeks ago, I don't think it's quite been a month, but the New York Times did an awesome piece of investigative journalism in which they broke down numerous instances of the Trump DOJ being, investigating and trying to prosecute, and sometimes successfully prosecuting, Donald Trump's political opponents. Just as a refresher, Trump and his allies have suggested that his constant threats to prosecute rivals and perceived enemies if he's elected again should not be taken literally. But as president, Trump tried repeatedly to use the powers of the federal government to investigate or penalize those he's considered foes. Okay, so I give you some examples. James Comey, the former FBI director. What Trump wanted done. Trump publicly called James Comey a traitor and pressed him to be investigated and prosecuted for disclosing classified information and mishandling the Clinton and Russia investigations. The Justice Department conducted a criminal investigation into whether Comey leaked classified information. Federal prosecutors and a special counsel appointed by Trump's attorney general examined whether he'd mishandled the Clinton and Russia investigations. The IRS conducted a highly unusual and invasive audit into Comey's finances. So the DOJ and the IRS did, in fact, attempt to do Trump's bidding. Andrew McCabe. Trump called McCabe a traitor. This, by the way, a recurring theme, and asked for him to be investigated and prosecuted for a range of matters, including whether he'd lied to the internal FBI and DOJ investigators. Trump said he wanted to get the IRS on McCabe and for him to be fired. The Justice Department conducted a criminal investigation into whether McCabe had lied to the FBI and Justice Department, and McCabe was investigated over whether he leaked material to journalists. Federal prosecutors and a special counsel appointed by Trump's attorney general examined his handling of the Clinton and Russia investigations. The IRS conducted the same highly unusual and invasive audit on him that it did Comey, and on and on and on and on and on. John Kerry, former Democratic presidential candidate, former Secretary of State under President Obama, also investigated by the DOJ at Trump's behest. Same probes into Hillary Clinton. So when J.D. Vance or MAGA Republicans tell you that Trump didn't try to use the powers of the federal government against his political opponents, they're either idiots or they're liars. And given that they're MAGA Republicans, it's possible that they're both. But it is not true that Donald Trump did not try to follow through on his threats. Whereas President Biden's Justice Department has prosecuted prominent Democrats in election years. Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, Bob Menendez, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, and had him successfully convicted, I might add. Henry Cuellar, a Democratic congressman in Texas, a state that we're desperately trying to win. President Biden's own Justice Department investigated, prosecuted, and successfully had convicted President Biden's only living son. Biden could have snapped his fingers and killed that investigation in its crib. Instead, he allowed it to play out, and Hunter Biden was prosecuted and convicted as a consequence. President Biden's own DOJ investigated President Biden. The Robert Hur, a Republican special counsel, investigated whether or not President Biden mishandled classified documents. And then Hur declined to bring charges because he didn't think the case could be made beyond all reasonable doubt. But anyone telling you that Biden's DOJ, Harris's DOJ, is exclusively targeting Republicans, it's just not true. They have conducted multiple enormously politically inconvenient investigations into their own party and into themselves, Biden included. So it's just a lie. This is the problem, though, is that J.D. Vance and others like them will look the camera dead in the face, lie to the American people, and hope that you have forgotten about all these sordid details of the first Trump administration. So if past his prologue, we have no reason to believe that Donald Trump would do anything other than relentlessly prosecute his political opponents, especially if his DOJ in a second term is not filled with loyal patriots who will push back on him when he needs to be pushed back on. And he said that that won't be the case, that he will surround himself with loyalists and yes men. So pretty unhinged stuff, and something to remember when you go to the ballot box in November. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.